There are stories we whisper late at night. Tales of candlelit rooms, stolen glances, and tangled sheets in stone castles. Of slow-burning passions sealed with poetry, and heavy doors that close softly behind lovers who know how to be quiet. But what if I told you that most of medieval intimacy happened right next to a snoring grandfather, a coughing goat, and 3 children pretending to be asleep under a lice-infested wool sheet? Welcome to the Middle Ages, where privacy was a rumor, pleasure was suspicious, and romance, mostly replaced by legal documents, land disputes, and gossip delivered by women who spun wool with one hand and moral judgment with the other. This isn't the story of knights sweeping ladies off their feet. It's the story of hoping your partner didn't step in manure before crawling into the straw pile that doubled as a bed, a seat, and occasionally a grave. So before we dive in, dim the lights, turn off the world for a while. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, hypnotic hum that covers the silence between breaths. Sink into your bed, or whatever version of a mattress you're working with, even if it's just a couch with a blanket that smells like nostalgia. And let's wander, together, back to a time when affection was regulated by the church, when lust was a sin unless it came with property rights, and foreplay often meant not sneezing too loud while the neighbors were awake. And as always, tell me where you're listening from. A rainy kitchen in Lisbon, a silent corner of Toronto, a crowded train to nowhere. Or maybe during your midnight shift in Sao Paulo while pretending to do your job. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what time it is for you. It's always oddly comforting to know who else is out there, eyes half closed, drifting into history with us in the dark. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. Picture this: a one-room cottage, thatched roof, dirt floor, exactly 0 locks. Your entire family lives here. Parents, grandparents, siblings, in-laws, and sometimes a cousin who never leaves and a hen with deeply invasive opinions. It smells like wet wool, boiled onions, and the faint promise of regret. This is not the setting for a romantic encounter. And yet, in the medieval world, this is where most sex happened. Surrounded by snores, livestock, and the ever-present smell of stew that's been reheated so many times it's now considered a family heirloom. There was no such thing as a bedroom. The word itself implies too much luxury. There was, at best, a bed corner. Maybe a straw mattress, if you were particularly blessed that year. A blanket made of rough wool, and possibly a wooden frame that creaked like an old man confessing his sins every time you shifted your weight. Privacy, in the modern sense, simply didn't exist. There were no doors to close, no "do not disturb" signs. If you wanted to be alone, you didn't just wait for the kids to sleep. You waited for the kids, the neighbors, the goat, the spirits, and God himself to be distracted, ideally all at once. And even then, you had to be fast, quiet, possibly invisible, because gossip in a medieval village traveled faster than the Black Death in a windstorm. And unlike the plague, gossip didn't kill you, it just made you wish it had. For most peasants, sex was not a candlelit affair but a logistical nightmare. No soft music, no scented oil, no strategically arranged pillows. There was only the hope that no one rolled over, lit a candle, and asked if you needed help with anything. And it wasn't just peasants. Even nobles, with their grand halls and slightly more expensive goats, weren't immune. Castles echoed. Servants lurked in corners like unpaid ghosts. And sometimes the priest was staying the night in the room next door, writing a sermon on the evils of the flesh while eavesdropping with holy concern. Among the wealthy, intimacy wasn't so much spontaneous as it was negotiated, scheduled like a military campaign, timed between religious festivals, political crises, harvests, and moments of moral leniency. Ideally conducted before the candles burned out. Because beeswax was expensive and nothing ruins a spiritual moment like tripping in the dark over a tapestry. And then there were the traveling spouses. Merchants, soldiers, and crusaders often vanished for months, sometimes years. Marital affection became a memory, a fantasy, or a carefully avoided topic during feast days. Some women waited, others adapted, and many simply hired someone discreet to keep the hearth warm. Metaphorically, physically, sometimes both. And inns? Oh, inns were worse. If you thought privacy at home was bad, try sleeping in a bed shared with total strangers. In a room where the walls were just heavy curtains and the pillows were filled with mystery straw and tiny, angry insects. Yes, you heard that right. Shared beds. As in, hello, I don't know you, but I'll be spooning you all night while pretending this is perfectly normal. If you wanted a moment of affection in that setting, you'd better check first. Is your bunkmate awake? Do they have scurvy? Are they wearing chainmail? To cope with the chronic lack of space and the overwhelming surplus of judgment, people got creative. Coded gestures. Late-night trips to the well that took just a bit too long. Whispers behind the bread ovens. Phrases like "meet me by the grain sacks after vespers," which in medieval flirting translated to "I like you, and I'm willing to risk damnation." Affection had to sneak in sideways. Not grand declarations, but quiet nods. Not passionate kisses, but subtle touches when passing a ladle. Not poetry, but shared silence that lingered longer than it needed to. Because more than anything, medieval sex was a game of strategy. A slow, delicate game, like chess. Except the chessboard is made of mud. The rules change every week, and you're likely to be judged by someone named Agnes who heard something through the window. And yet, they tried. They loved. They laughed, sometimes during, sometimes after. They risked humiliation and eternal consequences. For a few seconds of warmth in a world made entirely of cold stone and colder expectations. Because that's what humans do. Even in a world where the beds were splintered, the sermons endless, and the pigs occasionally joined you on the mattress, people still reached for each other in the dark. And yes, Aunt Gertrude was probably still in the corner, churning butter, pretending not to notice, judging, always judging. So if you were planning on anything intimate, your options were simple, though none of them comforting. A. Wait until everyone was asleep. B. Hope the fire crackling was loud enough. C. Learn to move very, very slowly. D. Accept that intimacy, like good bread, was a luxury best imagined and rarely achieved. Upper-class homes weren't much better. Yes, they had more rooms with tapestries, fireplaces, and decorative chairs no one ever sat in. But they also had more people paid to stand in those rooms and pretend they didn't see anything. Ladies had chambermaids. Lords had squires. Children had governesses. The dogs had keepers. And everyone had eyes. Judging, blinking, occasionally eavesdropping eyes. Privacy wasn't just rare. It was unnecessary, perhaps even suspicious. Because in many circles, wanting to be alone, even with your spouse, raised eyebrows. Why would a married couple need to hide behind a door unless they were doing something sinful? After all, if God could see everything, then why not Gerald the stable boy? It wasn't uncommon for a noble couple to share their bed with a maid curled at the foot, a bodyguard asleep on a nearby bench, and a tapestry depicting a biblical scene of punishment staring at them from the wall. Because nothing ignites romance like the silent judgment of St. Augustine woven into linen. Consent, at least the way we understand it now, didn't quite exist. Marriage was a spiritual contract, sure, but inside that contract, everything became blurred. Marital duties were expected, demanded, normalized. A no wasn't a boundary. It was a theological inconvenience. The term marital debt wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. A spouse owed sexual access the way one owed rent or taxes or butter to the local lord. And this wasn't a concept whispered among shady barmaids. It was preached from pulpits by men who hadn't touched another human in decades. A man could, and often did, bring his frustrations to a priest. "My wife won't lie with me," he'd say, and the priest, nodding solemnly and full of wisdom he never tested, would remind her of her sacred obligation, preferably with a verse and a warning. Exhaustion, grief, discomfort, not valid excuses. Not when the marriage contract was viewed as a permanent open-door policy. The church had thoughts, so many thoughts, about when you could have sex, how often, with whom, in which position, and ideally, how quietly. Spoiler, the answer was almost always less. Less frequency, less noise, less joy, and preferably with a blanket covering everything but your guilt. Missionary was not just encouraged, it was expected. Not for any romantic or physical reason, but because it was considered the natural order. As if God himself had popped in once, peeked over someone's shoulder, and given a polite thumbs up while muttering, "Yes, that'll do." Anything else, standing, sideways, enthusiastic, was stamped as unholy. Filed under "you'll burn for this," and occasionally noted by priests who seemed just a little too curious. Joy, in the medieval bedroom, was dangerous. Laughter, sinful. Eye contact, risky. Confession became a strange ritual of whispered admissions and awkward priestly questioning. Did you engage in acts of lust, even with your lawful husband? And you, eyes down, voice trembling, would admit that yes, there was a moment of pleasure, followed, naturally, by shame, fasting, and maybe an extra round of penance. Now imagine saying that aloud, while your neighbor waited in line behind you, holding a basket of eggs, a slightly judgmental smile, and her own secret sin involving the baker and a misplaced apron. But worse than confession? The calendar. The church created a liturgical obstacle course of forbidden days. Holy days, feast days, fast days, mourning days, saints' birthdays, Mary's various moods, Lent, Advent, Fridays, Sundays, the day after someone important died, the day before someone important was born. By the time you dodged all these celestial restrictions, you were left with roughly 3 Tuesdays in April and maybe a Thursday in October. assuming the moon didn't look particularly judgmental that evening. Sex was allowed, but only in theory. In practice, it was like owning a horse you're never allowed to ride unless the bishop says so. Not feeling particularly aroused by obligation and dread? Too bad. Desire, they said, was dangerous. Love was fine, but only if it produced children. Pleasure was suspicious. And passion? Passion was a moral flu. Something to confess, survive, and avoid catching again. Even those who genuinely loved each other learned to express it in silence. Not in poetry, but in folded linens. Not in kisses, but in how carefully someone scraped your bowl clean. Joy was private. Grief was public. And intimacy lived in stolen spaces. Beneath the stairs, between prayers, behind baskets of laundry, or in the way someone said your name when no one else was listening. Because to love in the Middle Ages was to hide it, to protect it, to never speak it too loud in case the walls echoed. And occasionally, they laughed, in the middle of shame, in the middle of a sermon, in the middle of the night, with someone breathing beside them, and the knowledge that, despite the rules, the threats, and Aunt Gertrude churning butter 5 feet away, they were still human. Of course, if you thought things got steamier once the church arrived, think again, because nothing crushes intimacy like a bishop entering the conversation. To remind you that Tuesday is a holy day, Wednesday is for penance, and Thursday is the feast of Saint Refrain from Carnal Thoughts. Oh, and touching your wife with enthusiasm might condemn your soul for eternity. Enjoy. In the grand paradox of medieval theology, marriage was sacred, sex was permitted, pleasure, suspicious, dangerous, possibly contagious. The Church only recognized one valid reason for physical intimacy: reproduction. Not love, not bonding, not warming each other's feet in winter, just babies. If no pregnancy could happen, then what were you doing, exactly? Theologians had a word for it: fornicating, even if you were married. They wrote books about it. Books with long, serious titles and extremely uncomfortable footnotes. Books explaining that sex was forbidden during Lent, Advent, on feast days, fast days, funerals, and full moons that coincided with market days. Basically, any time something holy was happening, which, in medieval Europe, was roughly always. One popular guidebook from the 13th century stated, couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. Which sounds less like love, and more like assembling a bookshelf with no screws and a priest watching. But it didn't stop there. The Church wanted to schedule your desires and inspect them. Confession became more than spiritual. It was anatomical. Did you enjoy it too much? Did you smile? Did you innovate? One friar reportedly asked couples if they had exceeded the proper amount of marital joy. The fact that there was a measurable limit? That's the most medieval thing of all. Of course, enforcement was hit or miss. Some parishes were strict. Others, not so much. Some priests truly believed in moral discipline. Others quietly nodded while sipping wine and thinking about dinner. And the peasants? They nodded too. Then went home, blew out the candles, and did whatever they were going to do anyway. Just in the dark, with fewer words, and a lot more blankets muffling the sounds. Because for most people, life wasn't about theological perfection. It was about staying warm, feeding children, keeping the same pair of boots dry for more than 3 days, So when the opportunity for closeness arose, they took it, carefully, quickly, joyfully, and with the full knowledge that it might be their only moment of warmth that week. And even the holy weren't immune. Monks and nuns lived behind high walls. But even the tallest walls couldn't keep out human nature. Love letters were found. Pregnancies happened. Midnight meetings behind the herb garden were recorded in monastery chronicles, often disguised as gardening accidents. One abbey even raised its walls higher, not to defend against armies, but to hide the scandal inside. So yes, desire persisted, even under the weight of robes, rules, and centuries of judgment. Because no matter how many sermons were preached, how many calendars were marked, or how many butter churns sat in the corner, humans still reached for each other, quietly, desperately, and sometimes, miraculously, with love. For everyone else, though, there was a kind of daily performance, pretending not to want, not to notice, not to care. Courtship became code. A glance at the well, a borrowed handkerchief, a festival dance that lasted half a second too long. Romance wasn't written in letters, it was passed in bread, shared in silence, and hidden between obligations. The fear of judgment wasn't just about the church. Communities were small. Everyone knew everything, and walls were thin. If someone heard something, well, by morning, 3 bakers and your aunt would have an opinion on your morality, your technique, and your likelihood of bearing cursed children. And yet people still loved. They still touched, hoped, reached for each other. Even when the rules didn't make room for tenderness. Even when the beds were hard, and the sermons louder than the moans they were meant to suppress. Because under all the hay, fabric, and shame, people are still people. And even when told not to, they still want to be close. If you were caught, and let's face it, you probably were, the consequences depended on your status, your location, and how interesting your neighbors were feeling that week. Because justice in the medieval world had 2 speeds, slow and theatrical. A peasant couple getting frisky behind the barley sacks might face a small fine and a long sermon delivered with prolonged eye contact. A noble woman caught with her stable boy? That could spark a regional feud, an annulment, or in more exciting cases, a quiet disappearance. Honor, you see, wasn't just a concept. It was a currency. Virginity was not simply a virtue, it was a receipt. Especially for women of status. Your hymen wasn't a body part. It was a legal clause, a social contract, and, occasionally, a political landmine. It wasn't about morality. It was about property, alliances, and whether your father could still get that vineyard as part of the deal. To prove that you were untouched, noble brides were sometimes inspected, either symbolically or horrifically literally, by midwives or matrons. And after the wedding night, the infamous bedsheet display. A blood-stained cloth, waved like a medieval Yelp review for purity, hung outside for the neighbors to admire. Because nothing says intimacy like public evidence. Men, naturally, were not subjected to such scrutiny. Male virginity was treated like optional seasoning, charming if present, completely irrelevant if not. No one checked their sheets. No one asked awkward questions in confession. A future husband's experience was considered a bonus. A future wife's was considered a scandal. And while the church loudly condemned extramarital desire, it was strangely accommodating when it came to extramarital accusations. Adultery, fornication, acts of carnality, all carefully categorized in confession manuals like sins on a medieval menu. Some even included diagrams, in case your imagination lacked precision. The enforcement was inconsistent. Some towns punished offenders with fines, public shaming, or forced penance. Others got creative. There are records of adulterers paraded through villages in nothing but their undergarments, sometimes carrying symbolic items: a loaf of bread for gluttony, a wooden spoon for lechery, because why not mix humiliation with visual metaphor? But most of the time, the real punishment was gossip. The kind that stuck to you like smoke. It followed you to the market, to mass, to your deathbed. You became the one who, and there was always someone ready to complete the sentence. Still, people took the risk, because the alternative was loneliness, or silence, or a marriage brokered between two families who hated each other but liked the same goat pasture. For many, sex before marriage wasn't rebellion, it was insurance. If you were already intimate, your families might feel pressured to marry you off before the baby showed up. If the baby showed up anyway, well, they'd simply adjust the wedding date on the invitation. Among the peasantry, these things were handled with a mix of pragmatism and shrugs. If you were obviously a couple and a child was on the way, a marriage usually followed, hastened by a father, a dowry, or a pitchfork. Among nobles, it was messier. Scandals meant lost inheritances. Bastards complicated bloodlines. And reputations once dented never quite shone again. So love, real love, had to survive in the margins. In the stolen glances, the secret notes, the long walks that detoured just far enough from the village path to allow for a few quiet minutes of breathing each other in. There were no sex education classes, no therapists, no romantic comedies to teach them what desire was supposed to look like. Just instinct, curiosity, and 1,000 unspoken rules. The logistics were even worse. Contraception, such as it was, included things like drinking boiled beaver testicle tea, wearing charms carved by mildly suspicious monks, or hopping up and down immediately afterward and praying for gravity to take your side. Linen soaked in strange herbal pastes was sometimes used, not always successfully. Others simply hoped for the best, or the worst, depending on your perspective. And when things went wrong, which they often did, it wasn't a private matter. Pregnancies were visible. Babies were born into shame, or passed off as early arrivals, or left at the church steps. The punishment wasn't always from the heavens. Sometimes it wore the face of your neighbor. Still, they persisted. They kissed behind stables, whispered under moonlight, shared beds when the harvest was good and the mood was brave. Because no matter how tightly society tried to bind the body, it could never fully chain the heart. Or the hormones. They carved moments out of chaos. Not because it was allowed, but because it was necessary. Because in a world filled with sermons, sweat, frost, and obligation, the soft weight of another human was the closest thing to grace they would ever know. Of course, no conversation about medieval sex would be complete without bringing up the most iconic, and almost entirely fictional, artifact of the era, the chastity belt. You've seen the cartoons, the museum replicas, maybe even a novelty souvenir in a dusty gift shop. A cold metal contraption allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, ensuring loyalty through the power of rust and creative metallurgy. The problem? They probably didn't exist. At least not the way we think. Historical evidence is thin, suspiciously thin, and most examples that survive today were created centuries after the Middle Ages, during the Renaissance or Victorian period. Times obsessed not with chastity, but with the idea of medieval repression. The belts were often jokes, warnings, or collectors' fantasies, more erotic cautionary tale than actual undergarment. And thank goodness, because anyone who's ever worn real armor knows that medieval metalwork wasn't exactly comfortable. Now imagine applying that technology to your genitals, locking it with a padlock the size of a grapefruit, and calling it protection. You'd need a key, a blacksmith, and several ointments. In truth, fidelity was enforced through far more traditional methods: surveillance, shame, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were guarded like national treasures, chaperoned to the edge of suffocation. Peasant girls had entire villages monitoring them like unpaid security staff with very aggressive opinions about modesty. And yet, people still cheated. People still lied. People still loved people they weren't supposed to. Because the heart is famously bad at remembering calendars, marriage contracts, or who your cousin is technically betrothed to. Same-sex attraction? Of course it existed. What didn't exist was a safe way to talk about it. The church labeled it unnatural. Communities whispered about it in the same breath as demons, leprosy, and suspicious astrology. It wasn't a sin, they said. It was a sign. A curse. A deviation written in the stars or sewn into your bones like a crooked stitch from birth. And yet, the parchment tells a different story. The historical record is full, not empty, of poems, letters, songs, even court transcripts, all bearing the unmistakable tremble of forbidden affection. Queer love didn't begin in the 20th century. It just got better at surviving. It learned to shapeshift, to hide between metaphors, to pass as devotion, to wear the mask of piety while burning quietly beneath the robes. Monks wrote letters to each other under the guise of spiritual longing, dripping with emotion so raw it still blushes on the page. Noble women pledged loyalty in ways their husbands could never replicate, sharing beds, exchanging tokens, weaving secrets into each other's hair with fingers that trembled with meaning. Historians will debate their intent. They always do. But what's undeniable is the ache. The ache is real, and it echoes, no matter how deeply it was buried. Even inside monasteries and convents, where silence was law and purity a currency, longing found its way in. You can't put 100 emotionally repressed people under one roof, ban eye contact, and expect nothing to happen. Celibacy was a theory. What lived inside those stone walls was far more human. Repression, after all, doesn't eliminate desire. It ferments it. And then, there were the brothels. Let's dispel the myth. Medieval towns weren't moral fortresses. They were muddy, noisy, overcrowded, and full of contradictions. For every cathedral tower that scraped the sky, there was a dimly lit alley with a door that creaked open for a coin and a sigh. Brothels weren't just tolerated, they were organized, regulated, licensed and taxed, sometimes inspected. Some cities had entire red light districts mapped like commercial zones. And yes, there were officials called keepers of public women. It sounds like a lost Monty Python sketch or a cursed medieval board game, but it was real. Real enough to have paperwork. The logic behind it was chillingly practical. Better to control desire than pretend it didn't exist. Let them sin. Just make sure it pays rent, follows curfew, and doesn't scare the horses. Women in these places lived hard lives. Some chose the path. Others were coerced. Many were left with no other option. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't safe. But it was work. And it had structure. Opening hours. Basic hygiene standards. Repeat customers. You could pay with coin, wool, bread, or eggs. A barter system of lust. Even priests visited. Not all, of course, but enough to make the confessionals feel like punchlines. They preached restraint by day and pursued it by night. Holiness, after all, wears many faces, and some of them blush. There were literal handbooks on how to run a brothel. Guides detailing room cleanliness, fair pricing, what to do if a client weeps, and how to politely kick out a drunk night. It was medieval intimacy turned bureaucratic, a ledger of lust with footnotes. But beneath the transactions, love still flickered. Not the sweeping romance of courtly poems, but the messy, quiet kind. The kind that writes terrible poetry and hides it in the thatch roof. The kind that walks 5 miles through mud for one smile. The kind that memorized the pattern of someone else's hands just in case they disappear tomorrow. Because that was sex in the Middle Ages, not cinematic, not grand, but real. 2 cold people. A straw mattress. A moment that felt like mercy. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't always pretty, but sometimes it was sacred, if only because it was chosen. They didn't have dating apps. They barely had mirrors. But they had glances. And they had courage. Somewhere, beyond the frost-bitten fields and the grumble of oxen, a man and a woman lie still. They are not speaking. They don't need to. The silence is its own sentence. Whole, heavy, holy. Their hands are not touching, but they are not alone. And in a time when closeness could cost you everything, this stillness feels like defiance. Because no matter how tightly the rules were drawn, no matter how loudly the sermons warned, or how itchy the wool grew, or how aggressively the priest stared from the pulpit, people still wanted warmth. Not just of the body, but of being seen, known, felt. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't pleasure. It was survival. It was the body's small rebellion against the cold and the silence and the endless weight of doing what was expected. Passion wasn't a lifestyle. It was a flicker, a fleeting flare against the damp dark of obligation. A whispered yes in a world built on no. And somehow, even there, love bloomed. In stolen dances. In long walks that lasted too long. In torn letters hidden in grain sacks and forgotten shoes. In the blush that lingered after fingers brushed at the well. In the longing that stretched across fields, across classes, across rules, across the bruises left by a life too small for the heart it held. It bloomed where it shouldn't, where it wasn't allowed. And that made it even more beautiful. Because the most medieval thing about sex wasn't the belts or the rules or the shame. It was the persistence of tenderness despite them. Not because people were rebellious, but because they were soft. Even when the world demanded they be stone. We like to imagine them as other. As primitive. Cold. Distant. But they were just people. Tired. Hungry. Worried about taxes. Lonely. And at night, they too just wanted someone to pull the blanket higher and not ask questions. So they fumbled forward. Through bad lighting, worse advice, and centuries of misunderstanding. Hoping that somewhere between Vespers and Market Day, There might be time for one shared breath that felt like something more. And sometimes there was. So sleep now, listener. Let your thoughts wander. Forget the goats, the priests, the frost, the neighbors who never stopped listening. Forget the rules etched in parchment and screamed from pulpits. Forget the discomfort. And remember only this. Even in the darkest of ages, someone still looked across a fire and thought, I'd like to be close to you. But don't drift off just yet. Because while the haze settles and the whispers fade, there's another story stirring, not in a barn, but in the shadows of myth. A love story, yes, but one stitched together with grief, music, and a single, fatal glance. If you thought medieval sex was complicated, wait until you meet Orpheus. So adjust your blanket. Maybe take a slow breath. Turn the fan back on if it's gone quiet. We're going deeper now, not just into history, but into legend. Into a place where music can bend gods, but love still can't outrun death. Welcome to the underworld. They say that Orpheus could make stones weep. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Cold slabs of mountain and marble would tremble at his voice. Trees would lean in. Rivers would pause. Even time, that relentless thief, would loosen its grip just to listen. And at the center of it all was his lyre. Not just a musical instrument, but a key. A kind of golden-threaded magic woven from gut and grief and divine tuning. When Orpheus played, the world listened, not because it had to, but because it didn't know how not to. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even particularly good at conversation. But he had one thing, the ability to make you feel something you'd forgotten. To make your heart ache for things that never existed. To pull tears from eyes that swore they were done crying. And then he met her, Eurydice. Now, this isn't one of those tales where they fall in love over candlelight and witty banter. No, this was sudden, violent, even. Not in action, but in consequence. One look, and it was over. Not a glance, not a flirtation, a collision. She was wild in a way that defied poetry. She didn't walk, she wandered. She didn't smile, she questioned. And when she looked at him, it wasn't with awe. It was with recognition. As if she, too, had been humming a song she didn't know the lyrics to, and he was the first verse. Together, they made sense. Which is dangerous. Because the gods do not like when humans make sense. Their love was short, not because it burned out, but because the world couldn't stand the sound of it. Eurydice died. There are versions of how, a snake, a chase, a cruel twist of timing, but they all end the same. Her breath gone, her body still, and Orpheus alone with nothing but the echo of her laughter. He didn't cry. Not at first. He played. He played the fields into silence. He played temples into mourning. He played until birds forgot how to sing. Because why try, when he was already telling the truth louder than wings ever could? But then he did something no one expected. He went after her. Not metaphorically. Not in dreams. Literally. He walked into the underworld. Past the gates. Past the shades. Past the warnings written in bone and shadow. And here's the thing. They let him in. Because the dead missed music. Because even Hades, with his throne of stillness, tilted his head. Orpheus played. And the stones wept again. Even Persephone, frozen queen of autumn, felt spring creep back into her fingertips. They made a deal. Eurydice could follow him out. One condition: he couldn't look back. Not once. Not even a glance. Which, of course, means he did. But not out of doubt. Not out of ego. Out of love. Out of unbearable certainty. Out of that awful, beautiful human impulse to just make sure. He turned. And in doing so, he lost her. Again. Not to death, but to rules. To silence. To a bargain broken by hope. They say he never sang the same again. His lyre strings dulled. His voice, once filled with stars, now barely a whisper. Some say he wandered the earth. Others say he became a constellation. All agree on one thing: he never stopped listening. Because somewhere, behind the veil, there was still a chance she was humming along. So sleep now, listener. Let Orpheus carry your dreams. Let his music soften the spaces grief once sharpened. And if you find yourself glancing back, may it be not with regret, but with wonder. Because sometimes, the song is worth the sorrow. She wasn't running. Let's get that straight. The stories say she was fleeing from a satyr, a shadow, or some vague predatory symbol of what happens to beautiful women in myths. But Eurydice? She didn't flee. She wandered. She didn't scream. She sighed. Because when you're a muse in a world designed to devour beauty, you learn to walk softly, not out of fear, but because the ground is always hungry. She was wearing something absurdly white, not out of purity, but because poets love contrast. And as she stepped into that sun-dappled meadow, humming some half-forgotten tune Orpheus had whispered between kisses, the earth did what stories always do to women who dare to feel joy. It opened. Not metaphorically. Literally. She didn't trip on a rock. She didn't misstep into tragedy like a clumsy extra in a soap opera. She was bitten. By a snake. Because of course it was a snake. As if the gods thought, let's make it biblical and Greek. A single strike. Not dramatic. Not drawn out. Just enough. Enough to stop the song mid-note. Enough to curl her fingers into the grass like she could hold on to life if she just gripped hard enough. No last words. No final smile. No orchestral swell as she faded. Just silence. And then, darkness. But here's what the myths forget to mention. Eurydice didn't fall into the underworld. She arrived. Quietly. Upright. Confused. Because death isn't always a grand descent. Sometimes it's a missed heartbeat and then nothing. No judgment. No fire. Just a strange, sterile stillness. Like a waiting room without clocks. She looked around. No harp music. No golden gates. No horned demons offering contracts. Just shadows. Staring. And somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a lyre being tuned. Like the world above was already grieving, out of key, but earnest. She waited. She waited because that's what women do in myths. They wait. For rescue. For redemption. For relevance. But Eurydice? She didn't wait passively. She listened. She traced the cracks in the underworld's marble with her bare feet. She whispered her own name into the gloom just to hear it bounce back. She wondered how long it would take before someone up there realized silence had replaced her voice. And then she heard it. A note. Low. Aching. Familiar, like someone tearing open their chest and turning ribs into strings. Orpheus. Of course. Only he would be arrogant enough to try. Only he would be stupidly faithful enough to believe music could bend death. And somewhere, between the sigh she left behind and the ache he was carrying toward her, the underworld paused. Because it remembered what it meant to feel. And Eurydice, standing there barefoot in the half-light, tilted her head. Not with hope, with a half-smile that said, "Of course he's coming. Of course he'll ruin it." Because this isn't a love story, it's a tragedy. And tragedy always shows up when the second verse starts to sound like a promise. The thing about grief is that it's not loud at first. It doesn't crash in, throwing open windows and sobbing in corners. No, grief is polite. It knocks and waits. It watches you pick up your instrument again. It sits beside you while you pretend to rehearse. And only when you try to play something beautiful does it whisper, "She's gone." Not in a dramatic, echoing voice. Just plainly, softly, as if reminding you not to embarrass yourself. Orpheus didn't cry right away, because men like him, men stitched together with melodies and metaphor, don't break easily. They bend. He bent every note toward her memory, bent time with each rhythm, bent the heavens with a harmony that tasted like longing soaked in blood. He played not because it would fix anything, but because it was the only way he knew he was still alive. His music changed. It wasn't beautiful anymore. It was honest. It rasped. It cracked. It stumbled over itself like someone who hadn't slept in days and didn't want to start. The world noticed. Not the gods. They were busy, distant, bored. But the world, the trees, the rivers, the wind, they stopped. Birds forgot their own songs. The sun held its breath a second longer than usual. Somewhere, a newborn cried without knowing why. Because when Orpheus grieved, everything around him became a mourning dress. He wasn't the tragic hero yet. He was just a man who'd lost the sound of her laughter and couldn't bear the silence that replaced it. He began to wander, not searching for her, just away. Away from places that still smelled like her. Away from meadows where her feet had once pressed against the earth like punctuation. Away from people who dared to move on. He played in caves where his echo was the only audience. He played to animals too afraid to approach. Not because he was dangerous, but because sorrow that loud is contagious. He played to ghosts he could not see, hoping one might be her. And every note said the same thing. I wasn't done loving you yet. Not a scream, not a plea, a statement. Because sometimes, love outlives its vessel. Sometimes, grief is the lover that stays behind, whispering old vows into the dark. There were those who begged him to stop. Mothers said his songs made their children weep in their sleep. Sailors claimed the sea grew restless under his notes, churning up old shipwrecks and salt-laced memories. But Orpheus didn't stop, because this was never about an audience. It was a funeral, a slow, stretched-out burial where the coffin was invisible, and the priest was a liar. He composed a lullaby for the dead, and the underworld listened, not out of pity, out of recognition, because even Hades knows, a man who sings like that is coming. And just like that, she was gone, again, not ripped away, not snatched by demons or swallowed by the earth. No, that would have been kinder. She simply stopped existing. Like breath held too long. Like music played one note past its ending. Like a dream you didn't realize had ended until you woke up choking on silence. Orpheus stood there, eyes wide, hands still reaching, mouth slightly open like he might still call her name, even though he already knew. The rule had spoken. She had been right behind him. And now, the space was empty. It wasn't loud. It just lingered, like unfinished breath. He didn't scream. He didn't fall to his knees. He didn't smash his lyre into the rocks like a tragic lover in some badly staged opera. He just stood there, and the underworld, true to its nature, said nothing. Because hell doesn't gloat. It just endures. You see, the contract had been clear. No refunds. No exceptions. No extensions for good behavior or poetic merit. He had looked back. Not because he doubted her. Not because he didn't trust the gods. But because he loved her too much not to. And that, dear listener, is the most unforgivable thing of all. To love so deeply that you break the very rules made to punish you. That's what makes the myth work. It's not a story about failure. It's a story about certainty. He didn't turn around out of weakness. He turned around because he knew she was there. He just needed to see it once. To feel that microscopic, final, useless relief of yes, I was right. And that, of course, was the moment the gods were waiting for. Because divine punishment doesn't require thunder or lightning. Just contracts. And a heartbeat of hesitation. Persephone looked away. Hades didn't smile. He didn't need to. The underworld doesn't have to be cruel. It just has to be consistent. Orpheus descended for love. And returned with emptier hands than he arrived with. The gods didn't punish him. They just didn't stop him. And that's how eternity works down there. No fire. No torture. Just rules. Cold. Precise. Final. So he walked out of the underworld alone. Not because he failed, but because love, when done right, is almost always punished. Especially when it tries to cheat death. Especially when it almost works. There's a special kind of silence that follows regret. It's not peace. It's not shock. It's not even grief. It's the sound of the world moving on. Without you. Orpheus didn't cry. Because tears are for those who still believe in catharsis. He just walked. Up and out. Past the stones that had once wept for him. Past the ghosts that had once leaned in to hear his sorrow. They turned away now. Because the story was over. And Orpheus, he had ruined it. He had one rule. One. And he broke it. Not because he was selfish. Not because he was impatient. Because he was human. And that is apparently the worst sin of all. They call it a tragedy. But let's be honest, it's a setup. A test designed for failure. Who among us wouldn't have turned? Wouldn't have stolen one last glance? Wouldn't have tried to wrap their eyes around the one thing they lost, just to make sure it was real? Orpheus didn't fail the myth. The myth failed him. It promised love as a reward. It gave him a riddle with no answer. And now, here's a punchline. The man who almost made it. The man who sang so beautifully he moved the dead. And still couldn't keep the one person who mattered. He didn't go home. Because home is a place for people with futures. And Orpheus was now a man entirely made of past. He wandered. through forests that once echoed with her laughter, through villages where children whispered his name like a bedtime warning. Don't fall in love. Don't trust the gods. And for the love of all that is sacred, don't look back. But of course you will. We all do. And maybe that's what makes us real. Not the songs. Not the temples. Not the statues carved in our honor. But that moment, when we're told not to look back, and we do it anyway, because the cost of not knowing is worse than whatever comes next. That's not failure. That's love in its final, feral form. The kind that ruins everything at the last second. And would do it again. He stopped playing. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just less. One day, the songs didn't come. The lyre sat quiet in his hands, its strings untouched, like old scars, faded, but still sensitive to weather. Because what's the point of music when the one person who made it matter is no longer listening? Grief had finished its solo. Now came the echo, the long, slow, low hum of regret that never quite ends. Not loud enough to break you. Not quiet enough to forget. He didn't try to replace her. There were offers, of course. Women who mistook his sorrow for mystery. Men who thought they could love the pain out of him. Fools, all of them. Orpheus didn't need comfort. He needed punishment. So he gave it to himself. He walked where no one remembered him. He sang only when no one was listening. He played for shadows, for dust, for silence. Because he wasn't mourning her anymore. He was mourning himself. The version of him that died the moment he looked back. Regret, you see, is a kind of ghost. Not of the one you lost, but of the person you could have been. If you had just made a different choice. That's what haunted him. Not Eurydice's absence, but his own failure, his own hand, his own neck turning, ever so slightly, under the weight of love. The world moved on. New poets rose. New songs were sung. But none had that sound, that trembling ache in every note. That unbearable beauty found only in someone who loved too much and too late. They say the wind still carries his melodies. That if you stand alone on certain hills, late at night, you'll hear something between a sigh and a song. It didn't scream. It stayed, quietly refusing to fade. The kind of sound that doesn't want to be heard, but refuses to be forgotten. There's something dangerous about unfinished love. It doesn't rot. It doesn't fade. It crystallizes, becomes sacred, becomes myth. Orpheus and Eurydice, they became something bigger than a story. They became a warning, a shrine, a cautionary poem people whisper to themselves when they almost say too much, almost risk too far, almost look back. Because the love that never had time to disappoint you, that's the one we worship. We don't build altars to marriages that lasted. We don't write sonnets about quiet, steady affection that grew like moss. No, we idolize the love that ended before it could fail. The kind that dies young, unspoiled, untested, unfinished. The kind that stays perfect, because it never had to become real. Orpheus became the patron saint of what if. His name, a spell. His story, a prayer. His pain, currency for 1,000 half-written songs. And people loved him for it. Not despite the ending. Because of it. Because in his failure, we saw our fantasy. That if we ever lost something that precious, we too would walk into hell without flinching. That we, too, would turn around, even knowing what it would cost. There's something seductive about a love you never got to ruin. It becomes a mirror, and in Orpheus's mirror, people saw themselves. Romantic, broken, brave, doomed. So they wrote ballads, painted frescoes, lit candles to a man who destroyed everything with one glance, and somehow made it beautiful. It became a kind of religion, not of faith, but of feeling, of lingering ache, of unspoken yearning, the worship of the unreachable, the craving for a love so pure it can only exist in hindsight. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of all. That Orpheus wasn't remembered for his joy, only for his loss. And Eurydice? She didn't even get to keep her name. She became a symbol, a silhouette, a muse for a song she never got to sing. But maybe that's the price of becoming legend. To be adored for the pain you never asked to carry. Not all ghosts wear white. Some wear songs. They live in the echo of notes that were never supposed to be played again. In the chords that sounded too honest, too raw, too unguarded to come from a man still breathing. The melody had infected them, not as inspiration, but as a reminder that love, when true, doesn't just shape you, it undoes you. These were the widows of the melody. They weren't lovers, just echoes wearing human skin. People who lost something they never touched. They walked through life with that sound stuck in their bones. A constant tremble behind every word. A pause between every heartbeat. They lit candles to no one. They wrote letters they never sent. They held on to absence like it might one day speak. They weren't grieving Eurydice. They didn't even know her. They were grieving what Orpheus had exposed. That some love stories exist only to ruin you beautifully. He didn't ask for followers, but he got them anyway. Because humans are funny like that. We worship anything that breaks us in a way that feels like music. Some say the last song he ever played wasn't heard by the living at all. It was played for them. The widows. The dreamers. The ones who believe in love, not because they've known it, but because they've missed it all their lives. And somewhere, beneath the ache, beneath the ruin, beneath the impossibility of it all, they still hum along. He was never touched again. Not truly. Hands may have reached for him. Eyes may have lingered. But no one ever touched him. Not the way Eurydice did. Not the way grief did. They say he simply laid his lyre down and walked into the forest barefoot, as if trying to become part of the silence he had once defied. Some say the Maenads found him, that they tore him apart for refusing joy, for rejecting every woman who offered him warmth in place of ashes. Others say he became a constellation, a flicker of melancholy above the horizon, shining only for those who know how to look. He became a myth told in whispers, a song with no chorus. He became the warning carved into every heart that dares to love too deeply. Careful. You might sing your way into hell. And worse, you might not want to come back. Because that's the curse, isn't it? To love someone so much you'd rather lose yourself than live in a world where they're missing. To carry the sound of them forever. He looked back, and in doing so, taught the rest of us never to forget that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give someone is everything. And just when you thought the music had faded, When the echoes of love and loss had finally stopped vibrating against your ribs, something else rises. Not a song. A shadow. Heavy. Sandy. Older than memory. Wrapped in linen and wrapped, again, in headlines. Because if love is doomed to fail, then surely history is doomed to repeat itself. Especially when someone finds a locked door and decides to open it anyway. Enter Egypt. Land of pyramids, sun gods, embalming fluid, and curses that apparently wait politely for white men to arrive before activating. It's 1922. The world has just crawled out of one war and is sprinting blindly toward another. But in between, we find ourselves obsessed with something much older and much sexier. A tomb, sealed for 3,000 years. 3,000. That's longer than most civilizations. Longer than your family tree. Longer than any modern country has managed to avoid collapsing in on itself. And suddenly, it's open. Not by accident. Not by divine vision. By archaeologists. British ones. Armed with shovels, cigars, and the unshakable belief that anything ancient and non-European exists solely to be photographed, catalogued, and displayed under glass in London. Howard Carter. Lord Carnarvon. Names that still echo in dusty documentaries narrated in suspiciously slow British accents. They weren't the first to dig, but they were the first to get lucky, to find a door that hadn't been pried open by grave robbers or empire builders centuries earlier. A door that still whispered "Do not disturb" in hieroglyphs. Naturally, they disturbed it. Because when you're holding a trowel and a contract from the British Museum, no isn't part of your vocabulary. They chipped, dusted, photographed. And then came the phrase that would echo across decades. Can you see anything? Yes. Wonderful things. Spoiler, he meant gold. Gold masks. Gold statues. Gold-covered beds. Daggers, sandals, chariots, gold on gold on gold. And tucked in the middle of it all, a boy, dead at 19, wearing enough treasure to buy Europe, and enough silence to haunt it. The press went wild. Of course they did. They printed every photo, invented every detail, dramatized every sigh. They turned a dead teenager into an icon. They turned his grave into a stage. Because who needs facts? When you've got wonderful things. And more importantly, who needs respect? When the public is bored and hungry for spectacle. The curse hadn't been mentioned yet. That would come later. For now, it was all champagne and camera flashes. But beneath the glitter, something waited. Something dry, and ancient, and tired of being touched. Not a spirit, a story, and like all good stories, this one would demand a price. Digging is never just digging. It's ego with a shovel. It's the belief that the past is yours to unearth, rearrange, and photograph. Preferably before tea time. Howard Carter knew this. He wasn't just opening a tomb. He was opening a career. And the desert, dry, ancient, suspicious, didn't like cameras. Didn't like men with mustaches and imperial contracts and steel-tipped boots stepping on bones that were supposed to stay forgotten. But Carter didn't hear the whisper. Not yet. All he heard was applause. The excavation began with ceremony. Measured, meticulous, almost reverent. If reverence meant politely dismembering a dead boy's bedroom for export. They peeled back centuries like wallpaper, catalogued every amulet, every bead, every feather that once adorned a body reduced to silence. They called it archaeology, but it felt more like robbery in slow motion. The tomb had not been looted in 3,000 years, which, to the British, meant it was begging for it now. And so they took everything. Every statue, every sandal, every sealed jar full of who knows what. Except for one thing, the feeling, that creeping, suffocating hush that slithered in behind the journalists and clung to their jackets like smoke. It wasn't just dry air. It wasn't just nerves. It was something older. A presence. Not a ghost. Something worse. Relevance. Because in that moment, in that dim, flickering tomb where dust danced like ancient breath, Tutankhamun wasn't dead anymore. He was seen. And the dead don't like being seen. They prefer mystery, anonymity, rest. But now he was headline material. Now he was the boy king. Now he was page 3, next to scandals, horoscopes, and fashion tips from Paris. They say Carter felt something. Not at first, but later, when the last journalist left. When the air turned thick and the canary they kept, the one meant to sing through danger, stopped singing altogether. Some blamed a cobra. Some blamed bad luck. Some blamed nothing. But Carter began to wake in the middle of the night, gasping. His dreams full of sand and locked doors and eyes that never blinked. He didn't believe in curses. Not publicly. Privately, he started carrying amulets he swore were just decorative. He started avoiding mirrors. And still, he dug. Because once you open the past, you don't get to close it again. And whatever stirs behind the veil, it starts watching you back. It started, as most bad stories do, with a mosquito. Not a spirit. Not a hieroglyphic prophecy. Just a mosquito. The kind that buzzes in your ear and disappears the moment you try to swat it. It bit Lord Carnarvon, the man who financed the whole glittering grave-robbing operation. On the cheek. A tiny bite. Insignificant. Until it wasn't. The infection spread quickly. Fever followed. Then pneumonia. Then death. Sudden. Messy. Inconvenient. Exactly the kind of thing journalists love. Because British aristocrat dies of tropical disease isn't front-page material. But curse of the pharaoh strikes again. Now we're talking. Suddenly, everyone had a theory. Carnarvon had disturbed something sacred. He had violated an ancient seal. He had looked into the eyes of a god and blinked. Never mind that he had chronic health problems. Never mind that Egypt, in 1923, was full of disease, heat, and unfiltered water. Those don't sell papers. Curses do. And so, the fever spread, not through the body, but through the press. One journalist claimed the moment Carnarvon died, all the lights in Cairo went out. Another swore a cobra had slithered into Carter's home and swallowed his canary. A warning, they said, from Anubis himself. They printed it all. Every embellished shiver. Every gasping exaggeration. And the public? They devoured it. Because logic is boring. And curses are sexy. It wasn't long before every stubbed toe near the tomb was whispered about. Every sneeze became an omen. Every archaeological assistant who happened to die, weeks, months, even years later, was folded into the growing myth. The death toll became its own headline. The curse claims its 10th victim. The curse returns. The curse might be real. No one checked the facts, because no one wanted facts. They wanted mystery. They wanted horror. They wanted a bedtime story soaked in colonial guilt and desert sand. And so, the narrative took root. Not in Egypt. In London. In New York. In drawing rooms and parlors and the flickering glow of early cinema screens. Tutankhamun wasn't just a pharaoh anymore. He was dangerous. He was vengeful. He was, finally, interesting. All thanks to a mosquito bite. And a story that wouldn't stop itching. The funny thing about death is how quickly it becomes useful. Carnarvon's death should have been a tragedy. A quiet, regrettable consequence of disease and hubris. A footnote in the long, dusty annals of imperial excavation. But instead, it became a brand. The curse had arrived. And with it, the perfect storm. Wealth, death, exoticism, and a public desperate to believe the East was still full of dark, mysterious forces just waiting to punish Western arrogance. Of course, no one said it out loud. No one printed, "British man dies because he treated a sacred tomb like a souvenir shop." But they didn't have to. The headlines said everything else. And behind those headlines, profits climbed. Book deals, lecture tours, souvenir sales, tickets to see authentic Egyptian artifacts behind glass cases in museums thousands of miles away from where they belonged. Every whisper of danger added value. Every unexplained cough or unlucky fall fed the myth, and the myth sold. Carnarvon, in death, became more useful than he had ever been alive. His family leaned in. Reporters leaned harder. Carter, though publicly annoyed, privately understood that attention, even dark attention, meant funding. And no one wanted to be left out of the story. There were rumors of secret scrolls, of hieroglyphic warnings that only he could read, of curses scratched into stone with fingernails, blood, and metaphor. No one had proof, but everyone had quotes, and every new quote came with a byline and a paycheck. It didn't matter that Carter himself lived for years after the discovery. It didn't matter that many of the so-called curse victims had never even been to the tomb. All that mattered was the illusion, the delicious, profitable illusion, that Tutankhamun was watching, and striking, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet. Because what's more thrilling than a dead boy with a crown? A vengeful one. Especially when you can print his story in bold black ink, sell it for a penny, and call it journalism. Somewhere, in a newsroom filled with smoke and ego, a journalist tapped the word curse into a typewriter, and history never recovered. 4 letters, 1 headline, infinite consequences. They didn't invent the idea. The public had already begun to whisper. But the press? They weaponized it. Because nothing sells like fear. Except maybe gold. But they already got that part out of the tomb. The first article was cautious. Is the pharaoh's curse real? A question mark, the journalist's best friend. Then came the second. Another victim of Tutankhamun. Still technically a question. By the third headline, the question mark had vanished. It was now fact. Truth, wrapped in ink and hysteria. Served daily. No one questioned the logic. Why would they? Death is scary. Coincidence is boring, but a pharaoh striking down intruders from beyond the grave? That's content. And once the public bit, the papers didn't stop feeding them. They dug up relatives, friends, servants who stubbed their toe or caught a cold or had the misfortune of existing near Egypt in the early 1920s. They were all fair game now. The curse didn't need rules. It just needed bodies. Preferably British ones. Preferably British. Even better if titled or smug. Soon, every ache was ancient vengeance. Every death a divine receipt. They published diagrams, timelines. People stopped asking for facts. They asked for the latest. The next death. The next clue. The next symbol scribbled in red ink over a grainy photo of the tomb. Science took a step back. Superstition pulled up a chair. And the worst part? Even the archaeologists started reading it. Some laughed. Some didn't. Because once enough people believe in a thing, it becomes real. Not in substance, but in influence. And the curse? It was now unstoppable. Not because it was true, but because it had a column, a byline, and a deadline. They called it discovery. As if Egypt had misplaced a pharaoh. As if Tutankhamun had simply wandered off and been graciously found by men in linen suits and sunburns. But what it really was theft. Not the sneaky kind. Not the in the dead of night with a sack over your shoulder kind. This was the respectable kind. The kind with permits. With velvet ropes and descents saying please don't touch. The tomb wasn't emptied by looters. It was emptied by museums. They called it preservation, conservation, education. But the display cases didn't say, stolen under colonial oversight. They said, on loan. Loaned from whom? That was never clear. Because Egypt, as it turns out, had very little say in what happened to its dead once the British arrived with crates and confidence. And the public? They didn't care. They lined up. They paid admission. They marveled at sarcophagi and ceremonial daggers like they were souvenirs from a vacation they'd never taken. Children stared into the hollow eye sockets of gold funeral masks. And no one thought to ask. If the mask wanted to be seen, no one asked. If the body beneath it ever asked to travel. Because when history is displayed under fluorescent lights, it stops feeling sacred. It starts feeling owned. Tutankhamun, once a god-king buried with spells, warnings, and dignity, was now a brand, a postcard, a keychain. And Egypt? It became a backdrop, a cinematic desert for Western fantasies, a stage for stories that conveniently skipped the part, where its treasures were stripped bare and flown out in wooden boxes stamped with the seal of the crown. The real curse wasn't written in hieroglyphs. It was printed on customs forms, stamped in museum archives, filed under World Heritage. As long as that world meant Europe, they told themselves they were saving history. But you don't save something by stealing it. You don't honor the past by displaying its corpse. And you don't uncover truth by burying the theft. Eventually, science cleared its throat. It stepped politely into the room, wearing glasses, holding charts, muttering something about bacteria and environmental toxins. No one looked up, because the party was in full swing. Curses were trending. Ancient revenge was profitable. And facts? Facts were just bad storytelling. Still, the scientists tried. They pointed out the mold, the sealed, oxygen-starved chambers, the toxic spores released when ancient dust met fresh air. They talked about fungal infections, respiratory failure, hidden allergies. They mentioned that the tomb was sealed for 3,000 years. And maybe, just maybe, opening it without protection was a bad idea. They ran tests, analyzed remains, published papers no one read, because the curse had already gone viral, before there was a word for viral. And no one wants a logical explanation when they've already lit the incense and booked the seance. The public didn't want pathogens. They wanted poetic justice. They wanted anubis with glowing eyes, not aspergillus in the lungs. Doctors warned about insect-borne diseases, dehydration, and good old-fashioned colonial stupidity. But they were drowned out by headlines about pharaohs whispering from beyond the grave, and camels refusing to cross certain dunes. Science never stood a chance. It was too quiet, too reasonable, too unprofitable. You can't sell tickets to a spore. You can't turn a rational diagnosis into a tabloid sensation. You can't build a myth around a mosquito bite and a compromised immune system. So science got shelved, labeled inconclusive or disputed or boring. And the curse? It kept growing. Because once a myth finds purchase, once it wraps itself around the public's imagination, no peer-reviewed journal can pull it loose. And maybe that's the real irony. The curse didn't resist science. It simply outperformed it. He was 19 when he died. No military victories. No pyramids. No great love stories carved into temple walls. Just a boy, buried in a hurry, forgotten for centuries, wrapped in linen, gold, and 1,000 years of silence. And somehow, he became a global celebrity. Tutankhamun, the teenage king turned posthumous icon, the face of ancient Egypt, the brand ambassador of eternity. His image, once hidden beneath layers of tomb dust and ritual, now sold lunchboxes. Museum exhibits featuring his artifacts toured the world like rock bands. Tutmania took over. People waited in line for hours to see a coffin, to stare into the face of a dead child, encased in gold and mystery, and whisper, "Wow." His name was printed on everything: books, documentaries, t-shirts, toilet seat covers. His mask, that solemn, otherworldly face once meant to guide him through the afterlife, was reduced to a graphic, a logo, a mood board for luxury branding. And Egypt, still waiting to get half of it back. Tutankhamun became whatever the world needed him to be. A god, a ghost, a cautionary tale, a curse, a cash cow. He was remixed by historians, mystics, filmmakers, fashion designers. He was used to sell jewelry, perfume, and nationalism. He was exoticized, dramatized, commercialized, until the boy beneath the mask disappeared entirely. And no one seemed to mind, because Tutankhamun was never allowed to be human. Not in life, not in death, not in myth. He became the vessel for every fantasy, fear, and fetish the modern world projected onto the ancient one. And the saddest part? He didn't ask for any of it. He didn't write the spell. He just happened to be buried in the wrong place, at the right time. By this point, the curse had gone full franchise. And every good franchise needs a spin-off. Some fresh characters, new plot lines. Enter the psychics. They arrived in scarves and smoke. They spoke in riddles that never quite ended. Some claimed to channel Tutankhamun directly. Others insisted they had been Egyptian priests in a past life. A few just stared dramatically into mirrors and declared, "He is not at rest." No one asked for proof. They didn't need to, because belief had already replaced evidence. And the public? They were all in. They wanted more signs, more drama, more curses with theatrical timing. And the universe, or at least a few opportunists, happily delivered. Black cats began showing up in hotel courtyards near the excavation sites. Cameras jammed. Bulbs burst. People reported hearing whispers in empty rooms. Never mind that most of those rooms were filled with reporters whispering to themselves. There were seances, crystals, tarot cards pulled with trembling fingers and dramatic gasps. Even newspapers, once slightly embarrassed by the supernatural twist, gave in. Horoscopes suddenly included warnings about sarcophagi. Everyone from housewives to Hollywood stars started consulting Egyptian energy experts before booking flights. Because nothing says safety like hiring someone named Madame Ankh from a basement in Camden. Every strange coincidence was now divine punishment. Trip over a chair? That's the boy king reminding you to mind your steps. Lose your job? Tutankhamun disapproves of your career path. The myth had entered its tabloid phase. And it was unstoppable. It didn't need Carter anymore, or Carnarvon, or even Tutankhamun. It fed itself on fear, fantasy, and the eternal human desire to turn chaos into meaning. Because when the world feels unstable, there's an ancient reason for your spilled coffee. So maybe tonight, when the lights go out and the house finally sighs into silence, you'll remember more than just gold masks and broken headlines. Maybe you'll remember that history doesn't rest in museums. It lingers. In the dust we disturbed. In the names we misspoke. In the stories we sold as entertainment. When they were never ours to tell. Tutankhamun wasn't a legend. He was a boy, wrapped in ritual, buried in silence, and dragged, centuries later, into a world that never asked what he wanted, only what he was worth. So sleep now, listener. Let the curses fade. Let the sand settle. Let the noise of the living step back, and give the dead some room to breathe. And if, somewhere in your dreams, you hear a whisper from beyond the veil, don't be afraid. It's just a voice, asking, quietly, to be left alone. Good night, and may your ghosts be gentle.